Silas Thorne sat on his horse at the edge of the crowd, his hat pulled low, his eyes scanning the wooden platform in the center of the square. Silas was 60 years old, with a face like a dried-up riverbed, deep lines carved by decades of Nevada sun, and secrets he intended to take to his grave. He was a man of few words and even fewer friends. He had a small ranch 3 days' ride into the high Rimrock, a place where the wind was the only thing that dared to talk back to him. Then he saw her. She wasn't the first person they put on that platform today, but she was the one that made Silas's hand tighten on his reins until his knuckles turned white. Her name was Clara, though the auctioneer didn't care about names. To him, she was just Lot 14. She stood there with her wrist bound by a length of hemp rope that had already chafed her skin raw. Her dress was a rag of blue calico, torn at the shoulder, stained with the dust of a long journey. But it was her eyes that stopped Silas's heart. They weren't crying. They weren't pleading. They were empty. It was the look of a person who had already died inside and was just waiting for the rest of the world to notice. Strong enough for the laundry, pretty enough for the parlor, the auctioneer barked, his voice like gravel in a tin can, starting at $10. Do I hear 10? A man in the front row, a greasy-haired trader named Miller, laughed and raised a hand. Miller was the kind of man who enjoyed breaking things just to see them shatter. Silas knew Miller. Everyone did. And Silas knew that if Clara went with him, she wouldn't last the winter. Silas didn't think. He didn't weigh the cost of his hay, or the fact that his roof needed mending. He just spoke. $50. The crowd went silent. Miller turned, his lip curling in a sneer. 50? For that scrawny thing, Thorne? You've been out in the sun too long. $50, Silas repeated, his voice low, steady, and carrying the weight of a man who didn't bluff. Going once, twice. The gavel slammed down. Crack. Silas dismounted. He walked through the crowd, the spurs on his boots jingling like a funeral dirge. He reached the platform, handed over a heavy leather pouch of coins, and took the end of the rope. He didn't look at her face. He couldn't. Not yet. They rode for 2 days in almost total silence. Silas led the way on his buckskin, and Clara followed on a small mare he'd bought for her with the last of his gold. He had cut the ropes the moment they were out of sight of the town. He hadn't said a word when he did it, just pulled his Bowie knife, sliced through the hemp, and handed her the reins. She had looked at her wrists, then at him, waiting for the catch. When no catch came, she simply followed. The Nevada desert is a beautiful, cruel place. It doesn't care if you're thirsty, and it doesn't care if you're hurting. By the afternoon of the second day, the heat was a physical weight. Silas pulled his horse to a stop under the shade of a lonely cottonwood tree near a trickling spring. He hopped down, unsheathed his canteen, and handed it to her first. She took it with trembling fingers. She drank like a person who hadn't tasted water in a lifetime. When she finished, she handed it back, her voice a ghost of a sound. Why? Silas capped the canteen. He looked out at the horizon, where the mountains were turning purple in the fading light. Because Miller is a dog. She sat across from him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. You bought me, she said suddenly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. $50. That's a lot of money for a rancher. Silas poked the fire with a stick. Money is just metal. Clara, it doesn't keep you warm at night. You bought me, she repeated, her voice getting sharper, more brittle. So, tell me, what is it you want? The laundry? The cooking? Or the other thing? Silas looked up then. He saw the way she was bracing herself. Her shoulders hunched like she was waiting for a blow. It made his stomach turn. He realized then that she didn't know how to exist without being owned. I want you to eat your supper, Silas said quietly, and then I want you to sleep. We got a long climb tomorrow. She didn't speak again that night, but she didn't sleep either. He could feel her eyes on him in the darkness, watching, waiting for the man he was supposed to be to show his face. The ranch was a modest thing. A 2-room cabin built of cedar logs, a sturdy barn, and a corral that looked out over a valley that seemed to stretch into forever. For the first week, Clara was like a shadow. She moved through the house without making a sound. She cleaned things that were already clean. She cooked meals that Silas didn't ask for. And every time he walked into a room, she flinched. Silas did what he knew how to do. He worked. He fixed the fences. He chopped wood. He let the rhythm of the ranch speak for him. One morning, he found her standing by the pump, staring at the mountains. The wind was whipping her hair across her face. "My wife used to stand right there," Silas said, carrying a bucket of grain toward the barn. "She said the air up here tasted like hope. I never could taste it myself, but I believed her." Clara turned. For the first time, there was a flicker of something other than fear in her expression. Curiosity. What happened to her? "The fever," Silas said, "took her in 3 days. I buried her by the creek. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I think I hear her humming." He kept walking. He didn't want her pity, and he didn't want to dwell on the ache in his bones. But that afternoon, when he came back to the cabin, there was a jar of wild desert flowers sitting on the table. It deserves a chance to break their chains. Do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep these stories of the Old West alive. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? I love reading where our journey reaches. Peace is a fragile thing in the West. It's like a summer rain. It feels like it'll last forever while it's falling, but the sun is always waiting to bake the ground hard again. 3 weeks after they arrived at the ranch, Silas heard the sound he'd been dreading. Hoofbeats. More than one horse. And they weren't moving with the slow gait of a neighbor coming to trade. They were coming fast. Silas was out in the yard, sharpening an axe. He didn't stop his work. He just watched as 3 riders cleared the ridge. In the lead was Miller, wearing a coat that cost more than Silas's entire herd. Behind him were 2 hired guns, men with cold eyes and low-slung holsters. Clara came to the door of the cabin. She saw them, and Silas heard her breath hitch. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. "Get inside, Clara," Silas said, his voice like iron. "Silas." Inside. She retreated into the shadows of the cabin. Silas stood his ground. He didn't reach for the shotgun leaning against the porch rail. Not yet. Miller pulled his horse to a stop 10 feet away, kicking up a cloud of alkaline dust. He looked around the ranch with a smirk. "Nice place you got here, Thorne. Lonely, though. A man like you needs company." "You lost, Miller?" Silas asked. "Not lost. Just come to settle a debt. See, I've been thinking about that auction. $50 was a high price. There's your $50 back," Silas growled. "Consider a refund. Now get off my land before I stop counting." Miller stared at the gold. Greed fought with pride in his eyes. He looked at Silas, then at the cabin. He saw the barrel of the shotgun now in Silas's hand. A move so fast Miller hadn't even seen it. "This ain't over, Thorne," Miller spat. But he was a coward at heart. He didn't want to die for a woman he could find elsewhere. He jerked his horse's head around, his men following suit. They rode off, but the dust they left behind felt like a promise of blood. That night, the silence in the cabin was heavy. Silas sat at the table, cleaning his shotgun by the light of a single kerosene lamp. Clara sat across from him, her hands tucked into her sleeves. "He'll be back," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of hope. "Men like Miller don't let things go. You should have let him take me. You threw away your money, and for what?" Silas didn't look up. "I didn't throw it away. I was paying for the trash to leave my yard." "You don't understand," she cried out, suddenly standing up. The chair scraped harshly against the floor. "You bought me. You paid the gold. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of this whole godforsaken territory, you own me. You can't just throw down coins and walk away. Why won't you just tell me what you want from me?" Silas set the shotgun down. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow against the cedar walls. He walked over to the small desk in the corner, pulled out a piece of paper, the bill of sale, and brought it to the table. He didn't say a word. He held it over the glass chimney of the lamp. The flame licked the edge of the paper. It turned black, then curled into a bright orange glow. He held it until the heat stung his fingers, then dropped the ashes into a tin plate. "Nobody owns anyone in this house, Clara. Silas said. His voice was cracked, showing the age. If I ever see your shadow on this rimrock again, Silas said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, I won't use a rifle. I'll let the desert have you, and she's a lot less merciful than I am. Miller didn't wait. He ran. He ran until he disappeared into the sagebrush, leaving his hat and his dignity behind. A month later, the garden was starting to sprout. Green shoots of corn and squash were pushing through the dry soil, a miracle of water and will. Silas was sitting on the porch, whittling a piece of cedar. Clara came out and sat beside him. She was wearing a new dress, one they had traded for in a neighboring town, a simple thing of soft gray wool. She looked healthy. She looked alive. The stage stops in Elko tomorrow, Silas said, not looking up from his wood. I've sold some cattle. I have enough to buy you a ticket to San Francisco or east, wherever you want to go. You got your life back, Clara. You don't have to stay in this dust. He held his breath. He expected her to jump at the chance. He expected to be alone again, with nothing but the humming wind for company. Clara looked out at the valley. She watched the hawks circling in the thermal vents, free and untethered. Then she looked at the garden. Then she looked at Silas. You threw down those coins, Silas, she said softly. You walked away from the idea of owning me, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had a home. Why would I get on a stagecoach to look for something I've already found? Silas stopped whittling. He felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. He didn't say anything. Words were still hard for him. He just nodded and handed her a small piece of cedar he'd been working on. It was a carving of a flower, a desert primrose, the kind that only blooms after a hard storm. In the end, Silas Thorne didn't just buy a woman's freedom. He bought his own. He learned that the things we think we own, our land,